Previously in our Suikoden Retrospective series. In most cases, you have the time to optimize and get it right, which Suikoden 2 does in every conceivable way. Now, will we be able to say the same of some of its successors down the road? That remains to be seen, as innovating and pushing a franchise further can definitely have cataclysmic results if not handled properly. Welcome back to the channel. Happy New Year's. It is still the holidays as far as I'm concerned. LC here, back with another Suikoden Retrospective, this time tackling Suikoden 3. Brilliant way to start off the new year. I actually had a lot of fun making this retrospective and actually just a ton of fun replaying the game. Played the game when I was much younger, but actually revisiting this with a little bit of an older perspective, I think has definitely made the game age much better for me. As usual, guys, if you are new here, we are on the road to 1,000 subscribers. Please, if you like the video, please like, comment. I want to hear, because I've been having a pretty interesting conversation with the Suikoden community. I would like to hear what your favorite Suikodens are and what you didn't like about some of the titles, specifically 3 with this being the retrospective. Let me know in the comments down below. If you'd like to have some more Suikoden talk, feel free to add me on Twitter, join our Discord. I need some more people to talk Suikoden with, just to kind of big up how really insanely great this franchise is. It is a little bit under the radar overall when it comes to RPG titles, but I absolutely love the Suikoden series, and I'd like to talk to more people that are kind of same like-minded. But as usual, guys, we're going to jump right into the retrospective. Suikoden 3 retrospective live now. Okay, now, so jumping right into this as someone who's been currently marathoning the Suikoden series in their spare time, I've got to say the anticipation and hype to revisiting Suikoden 3 was at an all-time high. I've grown to greatly enjoy revisiting games with an older and a bit more mature mindset and a more nuanced outlook on the entirety of the world. So let's take a brief moment to discuss my history with Suikoden 3. I originally played Suikoden 3 back in my teenage years, but never got around to completing it. Ultimately, I did end up giving it another go about 6 years later in my early 20s, and I beat the game in its totality. When I think back and reminisce on my outlook on the game at that time and its overall legacy, I actually still held quite fond memories of the entirety of the Suikoden 3 story. Perhaps not quite the same level of fandom that I held for its direct predecessor, but I appreciated the overall journey nonetheless. My oh my, is time such a tricky thing? After my most recent playthrough of Suikoden 3, it has handily moved into my top 5 JRPGs of all time, if not on the lower side of that list. There is so much in this game to love, and every ounce of this game is sold with its own unique take on both the JRPG and Suikoden formula. While like most things in life, it's not perfect by a long shot, however what it does do is an exceptional job at evolving the series past its 2D beginnings, and while some of the ideas and evolution unfortunately fall a bit flat, most of the general ideas here flourish once the wheels start spinning. You can see that there's a very different direction being taken by the creative team regarding this title, and I can appreciate the level of risk involved with the change of the previous status quo from previous entries in this series. Throughout my playthrough, I found myself poking around older GameFAQ forum boards as well as Facebook groups and of course the Suikoden Reddit to take a look at what the general census was regarding this game. One word repeatedly sprung to my mind from the convoluted player feedback being provided, and that word is divisive. While we'll certainly dive into the meat of it throughout each section, there were a number of players noticeably put off by the numerous changes to the formula, from the Trinity sight system to the updated battle mechanics and the overall cohesion of the narrative being provided. This was relatively eye-opening for me, as within my own personal circle of friends who had played the game growing up, it was all but universally loved. Suffice it to say, it was curious to see some of the blatant hate towards this game, and possibly even worse than that, pure indifference towards its existence. Speaking of the creative team, this time around we have largely the same development cast from the previous entries, with Yoshitaka Moriyama once again serving as the game's director for what would actually be his swan song for this series, in namesake anyways. Don't be too bummed out there, guys. He's currently in the process of making a little game called Suikoden Chronicles. You might have heard of it. Okay, so before we go any further, let's address the elephant in the room. For many fans of the previous titles, specifically Suikoden 2, this game had a metric ton to live up to. I dare say it was very much in the same boat as other sequels that had to follow what are now considered RPG generational classics. Final Fantasy VIII following the Titan that was Final Fantasy VII, and Chrono Cross following the juggernaut that was Chrono Trigger. I mean, take a look at this recent poll that we have here from Japan of their top 100 video games of all time. This is as of this week. People still absolutely adore Suikoden 2. I mean, even as ass backward as IGN normally is, they still managed to peg Suikoden 2 as their number 17 as the best RPG of all time. And while the Suikoden series might have an overall smaller fan base than say a Final Fantasy titles, I dare say the passion of the Suikoden community and their love for their respective titles rivals any other JRPG fan base, respectfully so. So the two main questions we're going to focus on throughout this retrospective are going to be the following. First off, how does Suikoden 3 hold up as a JRPG title? And how does it hold up within the mythos of the Suikoden legacy and as a direct successor to Suikoden 2? Okay, so no fence setting on this one, boys. I think the story for Suikoden 3 is absolutely excellent and extremely underrated in my esteemed opinion as a part-time YouTuber. This is one opinion I feel is necessary to be as crystal clear as possible, so as to not confuse what I have to say next about the narrative and how it unfolds. We'll discuss spoilers at the conclusion of this video, as I don't believe the story can be adequately discussed in the way I'd like to without ruining one of the major plot twists of this title. So let's start with a few bullet points regarding the new settings that we have for Suikoden 3. Suikoden 3 takes place west of our previous journeys within the Dunan Republic, within the Grassland and Zexen regions that have been in conflict for an undetermined period of time. And our main three heroes this time around are the following: young Hugo, who's the son of the Karaya clan of the Grasslands, Chris, the newly appointed captain of the Zexen Knights, and Godot, a mercenary under the employ of Harmonia's Southern Border Defense Force. As for a bit of background regarding this new region that we'll be playing in, the Grassland folk are more akin to what most would consider to be traditional native tribes, who seek to live in a more harmonious nature with their environment while being more spiritually inclined overall. This is in stark contrast to the Zexen Federation, which represents the modernization of society with all the bureaucratic details that come with it. Throughout my playthrough, I found all respective protagonists to be universally excellent and offer compelling character developmental arcs and their own satisfying uniques and perspectives to this new world being presented to us. All of them get their respective time to shine and to be a complete badass, and to show if they are truly worthy successors of being Flame Champion. This title introduces a Trinity Sight system, which allows you to unfold the narrative in the manner you see fit. For the uninitiated, the basic concept is that our three lead characters, Hugo, Chris, and Godot, each have their chapters 1 through 3 led from their own personal POV. The thing is that you aren't locked into doing all 3 chapters in one sitting. You could, potentially skip around doing one of each chapter of each of the POV, or just marathon it through each character. The options are quite endless, and while I can appreciate the development team wanting to provide a level of player autonomy and freedom by doing this, this is by far, in my humble opinion, one of the major reasons most people never actually finish this game. The tonal inconsistencies can hit quite hard, and it definitely feels like you're going from 0 to 100, only to start at 0 again in many cases. This issue is amplified even further with the optional Thomas chapters, which play a bit like a slice of life episode. And while I wouldn't consider them bad per se, I can see how they can really throw out the player's rhythm. From my perspective as someone who's played a fair amount of both JRPGs and RPGs alike, one thing that most of them excel in is grabbing and keeping the player's attention, and building momentum towards the next event or destination. This is something that definitely feels lost at times when dealing with the Trinity Sight system, and likely why it was never brought back for subsequent installments. Personally, I think the idea of having multiple separate chapters that diverge into one unified story is something that's hardly executed well within the JRPG trope, as my experience with the other title that did it, Final Fantasy IV: The After Years, gave me very much the same vibes throughout my playthrough, and the narrative pacing issues can result in the players having a sense of tedium instead of intrigue when selecting the next chapter to play through. Going into Suikoden 3, you very much have to be here for the journey and not the end destination, as much more time is spent with character development for not only each of our main characters, but the majority of the direct supporting cast as well. Speaking of the cast of Suikoden 3, the series has always done a fine job of flirting the line between representation and stereotypes, and I've gotta say I was definitely impressed with the handling of diversity of the cast and very heavy subject matter that comes with it. Except for Gulami, that guy seems to have some very weird fixation with the attempted murder of children. What do you mean by that? Now, with this additional time and focus towards character development, this is definitely going to elongate the overall playtime. I can understand that this was not exactly going to be every player's cup of tea. I do personally think it is the right call for a narrative that is so multi-layered, being spun across 3 main characters. It actually allows for an excellent analysis of character motivations, a really good look at worldviews, and brilliant world building overall. Not only are all of our respective leads given ample screen time to demonstrate exactly who they are as a person and to really display their driving motivations, but we also get a very key opportunities to see exactly who they aren't as well in very pivotal moments throughout the playthrough. Both thematically and philosophically, this game does actively try and reach a bit deeper than its predecessor and is a welcome evolution to the series overall. One thing I've always appreciated about the Suikoden series is the power of the themes, and Suikoden 3 is no exception. There's a very noticeable focus throughout the playthrough on the issue of both casual and overt xenophobia, tied with the exceptional deep dives into societal classism, and an even sharper look to what has always been the hallmark for Suikoden: war and unity. Sergeant Joe actually gives one of the series' best speeches regarding what it means to be a warrior and what it means when you make the decision to fight. Quite moving, in fact. Another major theme that's put front and center is that of legacy and the ability to inspire. Throughout the game's narrative, you're told of the legend of the Flame Champion, a hero who saved the grasslands 50 years prior from an invasion from the Harmonian forces, and the world looks to our current 3 heroes to pick up the mantle as Flame Champion and bring peace back to the land. In closing of topics of themes, one thing I absolutely adored about Suikoden 3 was its primary conflict being a pure struggle of ideals. The idea about having the willpower to change your destiny is utilized as a catalyst for both our protagonists and subsequently utilized by our main antagonists to justify their ends. This was something that was definitely touched on within Suikoden 1 and 2, but I think the depth of the potential is mined here in a more satisfying manner throughout the narrative. Overall, I absolutely love the story, 9 out of 10. This is an area that has also seen very significant changes from previous titles, with the change to having 3 pairs of characters working in unison, as opposed to having 6 individual characters that were fully controllable in previous titles. While I was personally on board with this change, for the most part, I can certainly see why it drives the ire of many who preferred the previous iteration. With this updated system, several key changes to the formula are as follows. Depending on the current formation that you're utilizing, only one magic or special skill can be used at any given time, with the remaining character defaulting to attacking. If I had to take a wild guess as to why this was, I would have to say it's more than likely to balance the game's magic system, as spells are much stronger and more readily available at earlier levels than previous titles. Speaking of the spells, all of them look much better than ever before, and some of the true runes in particular have excellent magic animations that were actually pretty satisfying to watch every time they were cast. This time with other changes such as the newly introduced mounted units, which are actually utterly busted by the way, and the skill system, add the necessary layer of depth in this new and updated battle engine to give an adequate ROI on the potential level grinding as well as proper skill upgrading. So let's take a moment to talk about the new skill system. As opposed to previous titles where every stat would auto upgrade upon a level up, certain skills are now able to be directly improved, learned, and if necessary, completely forgotten. This new addition gives a player the ability to customize and fine-tune each party member to their heart's content, for the most part. There are still some obvious preferences for mages, tanks, melee users, etc., and their skill trees will reflect obvious affinities that they have, while giving options to potentially fix the character's shortcomings. As expected with such a free-flowing system, some of the permutations you can unleash with the skills and the right equipment variety are absolutely devastating. Young Emily and Juan come straight to mind. However, I never felt the difficulty of this game was removed, and there are still some very dicey encounters endgame that can easily give you a game over screen if not handled appropriately. And now, as I mentioned before, the Trinity Sight system has its pros and cons, but one of the most obvious ones is this game's direct insistence on keeping you with your core or default teammates for each of our main 3 protagonists' early chapters, which can actually lead to you having a stable of absolutely kick-ass stars of destiny that you can hardly use until the game's last 2 chapters, which is a bit of a bummer. I bring that up because one of the other major changes that we have within this game, the way major battles are handled. For better or worse, it has been pretty radically overhauled from previous iterations, with you actually being able to control units to a certain extent throughout the conflict. Now, this is probably the only section within the entirety of the game that you actually get to adequately utilize the majority of your stars of destiny, and by putting in additional time to ensure that you have a stable of solid fighters, actually makes some of these notoriously very difficult fights somewhat more manageable. I would never say easy because of all the Suikodens that I've played thus far, these are certainly the most difficult to win consistently, due to the pure existence of this man right here. And lastly, we have the return of one-on-one duels, which are largely unchanged from previous iterations of the series. However, I will say that there are a great deal more of them, and almost a handful to get through in each chapter, and they are no longer relegated to just the main characters. A welcome change for sure. Overall, these changes, 8 out of 10, some expected growing change, but I like the direction that they're going in. Miss Miki Higashino, come on baby, please. Me and the kids miss you. We miss you, baby. For the first time in a Suikoden series, I must say I wasn't absolutely blown away or entranced by the overall OST. That's not to say that there aren't some absolute bangers here. I think songs like Blade and Breezy are some of the best in the series, and I think the overall compositions are a direct reflection of the overall narrative and pacing of the game. The musical compositions for Suikoden 3 was handled by a brand new team, with lead composer Michiru Yamane taking over the reins in the absence of Miss Higashino. The themes for each town, castle, and village that you visit throughout your playthrough seem to carry more unique qualities than previous compositions in Suikoden 2. Like fam, you know when you stroll into Duck Village or Brat's Castle. Overall, the entirety of the OST exudes a very calming, laid-back energy, for better or worse. With the multiple point of views you'll have throughout your playthrough, you'll be visiting multiple locations numerous times, and the music never once felt overplayed or worn out. It just fits quite perfectly like a glove each time, and that I consider to be a success in my book. Would it be nice to have more standout tracks like the previous entries? Sure, absolutely. But I do believe in giving grace to new composers coming in to fill some pretty large shoes. Overall, I think they did a pretty decent job, but unfortunately nothing to write home about. 7 out of 10. Okay guys, it's time for everybody's favorite spoiler talks. Let's talk some spoilers here, alright champs? First and foremost, I gotta say that I think Luke is the greatest antagonist so far for the entirety of the Suikoden series. Now, hold the tomatoes, boys. I know that there's probably a lot of Luke Blight fanboys listening to this, me included. I think in its entirety, if you look at the complete picture from beginning to end, I think Luke definitely is the most complete antagonist, right? The one that's there from the beginning of the game to the end of the game. I definitely think he suits and fills this role beautifully. Now, I still definitely think Suikoden 2 by far has a better story. I think that Joey as an antagonist, due to his relationship with Ryu, he was kind of relegated to holding back a fair amount and perhaps definitely not as ruthless as he could have been. That's quite the opposite from Master Luke over here, as his building commitment towards his goal, while initially shaky, we see his resolve become quite ironclad in his commitment to change the wheels of fate. He's willing to do whatever it takes to achieve his ends. While initially I was a little bummed that some of the major cast members that knew him and interacted with him in previous titles, such as Flick and Victor definitely come to mind, or MIA for this entry, ultimately, I can understand why they wanted to push ahead with a brand new scenario for Luke's antagonist streak. Luke's driving motivations throughout the game and the additional insight that were given in his standalone chapter create an extremely compelling overall character arc for him, even if it seems slightly out of left field from his character that we knew in Suikoden 1 and 2. One thing I absolutely loved about his story was his perspective on the 27 true runes and their control of the entirety of humanity's existence. This is something that's been hinted at from my very first introduction to them way back with young Tyr McDowell. These are cursed artifacts that have the propensity to cause untold suffering not only to the bearer but their direct loved ones. But if I asked most people listening to this retrospective right now if they wanted a true rune imbued in their right hand, I think most people still would have said yes. Hell, coming off of Suikoden 2, I probably still would have said yes too. Well, after watching Luke's story, my answer for once would actually be no. The sheer amount of despair and desperation that is showcased from Luke throughout the game is actually quite harrowing and heartbreaking. His willingness to potentially sacrifice the lives of upwards of 1 million people to destroy the true wind rune and get out of what he considers to be the rawest of deals. The scene where he shows Sasori that they are nothing more than clones to bear true runes is one of the best in the entirety of the series. His story and character arc throughout Suikoden 3 is an analysis of a person that is doing what they feel is necessary to defy his fate and challenge God. The conversation that he has with the Flame Champion regarding Dharma and the inevitable ending of all things really drove home the existential nature of his internal crisis and legit gave off some Evangelion vibes at one point. While I think it's safe to say that the writing for this game is a noticeable step up from his predecessor, the writing in this end scene alone is quite brilliant. Now moving on from Luke, while this story is dramatically different throughout, there are several series hallmarks that the series just can't seem to be able to shake. A random Silverberg shows up to help on both sides of the battle, Uber shows up, and while I think this is definitely his most kick-ass depiction, we're only given the faintest amount of information about him, and once again he bails right at the conclusion of the war efforts, not unlike the previous two titles. At this point, certain elements, while enjoyable, are starting to get a little bit both repetitious and a bit long in the tooth. Ultimately, I think this might be part of the reason that we literally ended up lost at sea in the next Suikoden, both figuratively and literally. And one of the final things I want to touch on is the handling of Chris's narrative, which in some ways I think can be considered more timely for the current era that we live in. When we see her rather unfortunate Black Lives Matter moment in Karaya Village, and we see the step-by-step evolution of her not only as a knight, but as a person that wants to do better and to not repeat the mistakes of the past. This is truly the best arc in the entirety of the game. Her story in the game then pivots over to her chase to find her father, aka Mr. Cultural Appropriation Jimba, who is her father in the worst kept secret in the entire game, and that leads into my final gripe about the game. I think that Chris and Hugo are very clearly built up to be the Flame Champion, and they are both set up to be the natural successor. Geto is actually my favorite character in the entire game, but he isn't given nearly the same amount of love. Even in Hugo's ending, which I chose him as a Flame Champion, Geto isn't even in the last scene. They don't even show Geto at the end, what the hell? For somebody that's one of the three main characters, he kind of got shafted. Justice for Geto. And that's going to be it for Suikoden 3, guys. Overall, I'll give the game a very crispy 8.7, and it's definitely aged incredibly well. And while I didn't really touch on this in the review, I think the game's art style has also certainly helped it on this front. While initially this art style that they went with might have been considered a bit of an obscure pick graphically, and some of the facial expressions seem to only really switch between this and this, I think it actually does a pretty decent job of standing the test of time. Consider me a fan. So all that being said, let's circle back to our initial questions. How does Suikoden 3 hold up as a JRPG title, and how does it hold up within the mythos of the Suikoden legacy and as a direct successor to Suikoden 2? I think as a JRPG title, it's quite excellent and stands on its own 2 feet regardless of the Suikoden namesake. There is an excellent narrative tied with the series' most complete antagonist with universally excellent character development throughout. And now to answer the significantly bigger question of the two, does it live up as a successor to Suikoden 2? I would say yes. However, your perspective on what a true and worthy successor may vary to certain degrees. Spiritually, it hits all the same beats as the previous 2 entries quite handily. However, the route and time it takes to get there, I believe is where the majority of the disconnect from the fan base comes from. This game requires a great deal more player patience for an arguably weaker overall narrative in comparison to Suikoden 2. Perhaps I just see it through a slightly different lens. This was a title that was going to be prone to more growing pains than any previous iteration up to this point, as it was the first on a new hardware system, while also having the task of trying to build a new fan base and appease the legacy Suikoden fans. Any way you slice it, that's a very tall order for any development team, and I think that they came through quite admirably with a product that stands the test of time in my very humble opinion. I mean, we can't all be Final Fantasy X out here. It's fine to have some stumbles on your first time out on a new playing field. Join us next time and let me know what you think of Suikoden 3 down in the comments. If you liked the video, please make sure you share with your friends. I'd like to hear what you guys think down in the comments. I've been having some pretty damn good conversation with the Suikoden community. I want to know what you guys think about Suikoden 3, what you liked, what you didn't like. If you didn't finish it, what was the turnoff, what was the major issue? But as mentioned before, we are on the road to 1,000 subscribers. So please, if you like the content, we're going to do all 5 Suikodens. And then after that, we're going to do like some rankings and stuff like that. Best characters, best antagonists, rank the series and everything like that. So a lot of Suikoden content coming through after we finish the main title. So if you like RPG content, please make sure you mash that subscribe button. Like, tell your friends. LC signing out. Peace.